The young Marines couldn't help but smirk when the weathered civilian unrolled his hand-drawn map across the tactical table, its faded ink and shaky lines looking like something from a different era. But when he pointed to a cluster of caves no satellite had ever detected, General Bradford's hand shot up, silencing the entire briefing room in an instant. What did this old man know that billion-dollar intelligence had missed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sandstorm had finally cleared that morning, leaving a fine layer of dust coating everything inside Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Captain Derek Morrison wiped the grit from his eyes as he made his way toward the command tent, the Iraqi sun already scorching, despite it being barely 800 hours. He'd been in country for 7 months now, leading Alpha Company through some of the most volatile terrain in Al Anbar province, and he'd learned to trust 2 things: his Marines and his intelligence reports. The briefing room was packed when he arrived. 32 Marines, 2 Navy corpsmen, and a handful of Army liaisons filled the space, their desert fatigues still bearing yesterday's dust. At the head of the room stood General Marcus Bradford, a 3-star with silver hair and a reputation for being methodical to a fault. Bradford had flown in from Baghdad specifically for this operation, which meant whatever they were about to discuss was significant. "Gentlemen, let's begin." Bradford's voice cut through the low murmur of conversation. "We've received actionable intelligence about a weapons cache approximately 15 clicks northwest of our position. Satellite imagery confirms unusual activity in grid sector 47 Alpha." Morrison leaned forward, studying the digital display projected on the screen. The terrain showed a series of rocky hills and dried wadis, typical for this region. Nothing unusual caught his eye. "Sir, we've patrolled that sector 3 times in the past month," Lieutenant Jake Hendricks spoke up from Morrison's left. "Came up empty every time, which is exactly why they chose it," Bradford replied. "Our intel suggests they've been moving ordnance through that area under cover of darkness. The plan is to conduct a coordinated sweep at dawn tomorrow. Captain Morrison, your company will take point." That's when the tent flap opened. The man who entered looked completely out of place. He was in his mid-70s, maybe older, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of decades under harsh skies. His clothes were civilian, worn khakis and a faded blue shirt that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught Morrison's attention. They were sharp, alert, carrying the kind of awareness that only came from experience. "Who the hell is this?" Sergeant Ryan Castellano muttered from the back row, not quite quiet enough. The old man didn't seem to notice or care. He walked straight to the front of the room, with a confidence that made several Marines exchange puzzled glances. General Bradford's expression remained neutral, though Morrison detected a hint of curiosity in the general's eyes. "This is Samuel Hayes," Bradford announced. "He's going to provide us with additional insight into the operational area." Hayes nodded to the room, then reached into a worn canvas messenger bag. What he pulled out made Morrison's eyebrows rise. It was a map, but not the kind they were used to. This was hand-drawn on what looked like yellowed parchment paper, the lines sketched in faded ink, with notations written in cramped handwriting along the margins. A few snickers rippled through the group. Corporal Danny Chen elbowed the Marine next to him, grinning. Even Hendricks couldn't suppress a slight smile. Here they were, with access to real-time satellite imagery, drone reconnaissance, and digital mapping systems that could pinpoint a target within meters. And this old man was bringing them something that looked like it belonged in a museum. Hayes unrolled the map across the tactical table, using 4 spent rifle casings to hold down the corners. The paper crinkled as it flattened, revealing a detailed sketch of the northwestern sector. Morrison had to admit, despite its crude appearance, the map showed remarkable detail: elevation changes, rock formations, even what appeared to be dried riverbeds. "I know what you're all thinking," Hayes said, his voice gravelly but strong. "Old guy, old map, old information. But I'm going to tell you something that might save your lives." The smirks faded slightly. There was something in his tone that demanded attention, even if his methods seemed archaic. Hayes's weathered finger traced along a series of lines on his map. "This region here, what you're calling Grid Sector 47 Alpha, it's not what your satellites are showing you. The rock formations create natural blind spots, but more importantly," his finger stopped at a cluster of small circles drawn in red ink. "There's a cave system here that doesn't appear on any modern map." Caves? Morrison leaned closer, studying where Hayes was pointing. Our geological surveys didn't indicate any significant cave structures in that area. "That's because they're not looking deep enough," Hayes replied. "These caves were used by shepherds for centuries, long before any of your technology existed. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s, smugglers expanded them, creating a network that connects multiple entry points across 3 kilometers. Caves? Morrison leaned closer, studying where Hayes was pointing. "Our geological surveys didn't indicate any significant cave structures in that area." "That's because they're not looking deep enough," Hayes replied. "These caves were used by shepherds for centuries, long before any of your technology existed. During the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 80s, smugglers expanded them, creating a network that connects multiple entry points across 3 kilometers. Sergeant Castellano spoke up again, his skepticism evident. "With all due respect, sir, how would you know about caves in Iraq from 40 years ago in Afghanistan?" Hayes turned to face him, and Morrison saw something flicker in the old man's eyes. Not anger, but a deep weariness. "Because I helped map them, Sergeant. I was with a different uniform back then, doing a different kind of work. The same people who expanded those networks in Afghanistan came here. Same techniques, same patterns." The briefing room had gone quiet now. Even the cynics were paying attention. General Bradford stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes spent 23 years with the Defense Intelligence Agency, specializing in underground networks and insurgent logistics. He's been tracking these cave systems across the Middle East since before most of you were born." Morrison felt the atmosphere in the room shift. This wasn't some random civilian off the street. This was someone with credentials, with experience that predated their technology. Hayes continued, his finger tracing new paths on his map. "Your satellite imagery is showing you surface activity, which is exactly what they want you to see. But the real cache, the heavy weapons, the explosives, the coordination center, it's all underground. If you go in based solely on what your drones have photographed, you'll walk right past the primary objective." Lieutenant Hendricks stood up to get a better view of the hand-drawn map. "How accurate is this information? When was the last time you were in this specific area?" 3 weeks ago, Hayes said simply. That caused a stir. Morrison exchanged a glance with Bradford. A 70-something civilian conducting reconnaissance in one of the most dangerous regions in Iraq. It seemed impossible, yet the general's expression confirmed it was true. "I've spent the last 18 months moving through this province," Hayes explained, "talking to locals, mapping changes, identifying patterns. The insurgents think I'm just an old fool wandering the desert. That assumption has kept me alive and given me access your uniforms can't get." He pulled out a small notebook from his bag, flipping it open to reveal pages filled with detailed notes and sketches. "The main entrance to the cave system is here." He pointed to a spot on his map that corresponded to a nondescript rocky outcrop on their satellite imagery, disguised to look like a natural formation. "There are 2 secondary exits here and here, both rigged with early warning systems. If you approach from the standard patrol route, they'll know you're coming 20 minutes before you arrive." Morrison studied the map more carefully now, comparing it mentally to the digital imagery they'd been reviewing. Hayes was right about one thing. The satellite photos showed plenty of surface detail, but they revealed nothing about what might exist underground. "So what's your recommendation?" Bradford asked. Hayes's finger traced a different route on his map, following a wadi that curved around the eastern edge of the sector. This dried riverbed provides natural cover and approaches the main entrance from an angle their warning systems don't cover. It'll take you an extra hour to reach the target, but you'll maintain the element of surprise. Corporal Chen, who'd been one of the first to smirk at the old map, now leaned forward with genuine interest. What kind of force are we looking at inside? Based on supply movements I've observed, I'd estimate 15 to 20 individuals using the caves as a staging area. But the real concern isn't the personnel, it's what they're storing. I've seen heavy crates being moved in, the kind that require multiple men to carry. That suggests anti-tank weapons, possibly surface-to-air missiles. The gravity of that statement settled over the room. If Hayes was right, this wasn't just another routine sweep. This was a significant weapons cache that could cause serious damage if left operational. General Bradford looked at Morrison. "Captain, what's your assessment?" Morrison studied the hand-drawn map one more time, then looked at Hayes. The old man met his gaze steadily, without the desperate need to be believed that usually accompanied questionable intelligence. He was simply presenting information, letting it stand on its own merits. "Sir, I think we'd be foolish to ignore this," Morrison said finally. "Even if we approach it as supplementary intelligence, the route Mr. Hayes is suggesting doesn't compromise our primary plan. It just gives us a better angle of approach." Bradford nodded slowly, then raised his hand, palm out. The gesture was simple but absolute. Every conversation in the room ceased immediately. Even the shuffling of papers stopped. The general's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of decades of command. "Listen to him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Those two words from General Bradford transformed the entire briefing. The Marines who had been slouching in their chairs sat up straighter. The whispered jokes stopped. Morrison watched as Sergeant Castellano, who'd questioned Hayes just minutes earlier, pulled out a notepad and clicked his pen ready. Hayes seemed unfazed by the sudden shift in attention. He'd probably seen this reaction before, skepticism melting into respect once people understood who they were dealing with. He reached into his bag again, this time producing a series of photographs printed on regular paper, edges worn from handling. "These were taken at different times over the past month," Hayes said, spreading them across the table beside his map. The images showed various angles of the rocky terrain, but what caught Morrison's eye were the subtle details Hayes had circled in red marker. Tire tracks that disappeared into seemingly solid rock face. Disturbed earth that formed patterns inconsistent with natural erosion. A shepherd with his flock who appeared in 3 different photos, always in the same area, but never actually herding his animals anywhere. "The shepherd's a spotter," Lieutenant Hendricks said immediately. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Sharp eye, Lieutenant. His name is Khalil, and he's been working for the local insurgent cell for at least 6 months. Every time coalition forces conduct patrols in adjacent sectors, he's there, watching. His goats are just props." Corporal Chen pointed to one of the photos, showing a close-up of disturbed rocks. "This looks recent. Last few days?" 72 hours ago, Hayes confirmed. They brought in another shipment. 3 trucks arrived just after midnight, departed before dawn. Whatever they're stockpiling, they're adding to it regularly. Morrison felt his tactical mind shift into high gear. This wasn't just about finding a static weapons cache anymore. If Hayes was right about the regular shipments, this cave system was an active logistics hub. Taking it down could disrupt multiple operations across the province. General Bradford circled the table, examining the photographs more closely. "Walk us through the approach, Mr. Hayes, step by step." Hayes pulled his map closer, and Morrison noticed how the paper's creases formed precise folds, as if it had been opened and closed in exactly the same way hundreds of times. This wasn't just a map. It was a tool that had seen real use in the field. "Your staging point should be here." Hayes tapped a location about 2 kilometers south of their target. "There's a depression in the terrain that'll hide your vehicles from observation. You'll need to move on foot from there, using this wadi system." His finger traced the dried riverbed route he'd mentioned earlier. The banks are high enough to conceal your movement, and the gravel bottom won't leave obvious tracks. Staff Sergeant Nicole Reeves, Morrison's senior NCO, spoke up for the first time. What about civilians? Any villages we need to be aware of? Good question, Hayes said, and Morrison noticed a flash of respect in the old man's eyes. There's a small family compound approximately 1 click east of the target zone. 3 families, maybe 20 people total. They're not hostile, but they're scared. The insurgents have made it clear what happens to anyone who cooperates with coalition forces. Hayes pulled out another photograph, this one showing a simple mud brick home with a courtyard. This is the Abu Rashid family. The patriarch is 71, lost 2 sons in the Iran-Iraq war. He wants nothing to do with any of this, just wants to live out his days in peace. But if the shooting starts, his compound could be in the crossfire. Morrison appreciated that detail. Too many operations focused solely on the tactical objective without considering the human terrain. We'll need to establish a cordon, keep civilians away from the engagement area. Already anticipated that, Bradford said. I'm assigning a 2nd platoon to civilian control. Reeves, that'll be your responsibility. Reeves nodded, already making notes in her tactical notebook. Hayes continued his briefing, and what impressed Morrison most was the level of detail. The old man didn't just know where the caves were, he understood the entire operational environment. He knew which times of day saw the most civilian foot traffic. He knew that the local imam conducted morning prayers at 05:30, which meant devout villagers would be moving toward the mosque right as the Marines would need to be getting into position. He even knew that the insurgents typically changed their guard rotation at 0400, creating a 15-minute window of reduced vigilance. How do you gather all this information? Sergeant Castellano asked, his earlier skepticism completely gone. I mean, you're walking around out there alone, no backup, no body armor. One wrong move and he didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. This region had been responsible for numerous kidnappings, executions, and IED attacks. For a 70-something American civilian to operate freely here seemed to defy logic. Hayes's expression grew distant for a moment. I've learned that sometimes being old and appearing harmless is the best camouflage. People see what they expect to see. They expect Marines to be young, armed, alert. They don't expect someone who looks like their grandfather, carrying nothing but a worn bag and a camera that's older than most of you. But surely some of them suspect. Hendricks pressed. Oh, they suspect, Hayes acknowledged. But suspicion isn't proof. And in a culture that respects elders, openly challenging an old man without concrete evidence brings shame. I'm careful never to give them that evidence. I take photographs like a tourist. I sketch like an artist. I ask questions like someone genuinely interested in their history and culture. Because the truth is, I am interested. These people have fascinating stories, if you take the time to listen. Morrison found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about intelligence gathering. They'd been relying on technology, drones, satellites, electronic intercepts. All valuable tools, but they created distance. Hayes had taken the opposite approach, embedding himself in the very fabric of the place. General Bradford checked his watch. We're looking at a 05:30 go time tomorrow. That gives us approximately 21 hours to finalize the operational plan. Captain Morrison, I want you and Mr. Hayes to work together on refining the approach route. Use his knowledge, but verify it against our reconnaissance capabilities where possible. Yes, sir, Morrison replied. The general addressed the room. I don't need to tell you that this operation has strategic importance beyond a single weapons cache. If we can shut down this logistics hub, we disrupt their supply chain across the entire northern corridor. But more importantly, we do it smart. We use every advantage we have, including Mr. Hayes's expertise. Dismissed, the Marines filed out, their attitude toward the old man completely transformed. Morrison watched as several of them approached Hayes with questions, treating him with the same respect they'd show a senior officer. Corporal Chen even asked if he could take a closer look at the hand-drawn map, genuinely curious about the methodology. Hayes answered every question patiently, providing details and context. When someone asked about a particular terrain feature, he didn't just point to it on the map. He described what it looked like at different times of day, how the shadows fell, what sounds carried across the landscape. Eventually, the room cleared, except for Morrison, Hayes, and Bradford. The general poured 3 cups of coffee from the pot in the corner, the bitter smell cutting through the tense, musty air. "Samuel, I can't thank you enough for coming forward with this," Bradford said. Handing him a cup, Hayes accepted it with a slight nod. "Just doing what needs to be done, Marcus." Same as always. Morrison realized these two had history together. The way they spoke suggested years of shared operations, mutual respect, built on experiences he could only imagine. Bradford turned to Morrison. "Samuel and I worked together in Colombia in the late 90s, then again in Afghanistan after 9/11. When he contacted me about this cave system, I knew we needed to take it seriously. Why not just send the coordinates through official channels?" Morrison asked Hayes. "Why come here in person?" The old man took a sip of coffee, grimacing slightly at its strength. "Because coordinates are just numbers on a screen, Captain. They don't convey understanding. I needed to explain the context, the patterns, the human element. And frankly, I needed to see the Marines who'd be executing this operation. Needed to know if they were ready for what they're walking into." "And?" Morrison asked. Hayes met his eyes steadily. "Your people are solid. Young but solid. They listen when they should, question when they should. That sergeant of yours, Castellano, he's got good instincts. Challenged me right away, which is exactly what he should have done. Trust but verify, right?" Morrison couldn't help but smile. "That's what we teach them." "Well, it shows." Hayes set down his coffee and picked up his map, carefully folding it along its well-worn creases. "Now, Captain, let's get to work. I want to walk you through every meter of that approach route, every potential obstacle, every decision point. By the time tomorrow morning comes, you should be able to navigate that terrain in the dark." Morrison pulled his own tactical maps and a laptop displaying satellite imagery. As they worked side by side, the old man's hand-drawn sketches and the military's high-tech reconnaissance began to merge into a comprehensive operational picture. What emerged was something neither could have created alone, a plan that combined Hayes's ground truth understanding with the Marines' tactical capabilities. The sun was setting outside when Staff Sergeant Reeves stuck her head into the tent. "Sir, the platoons are assembled for the final brief." Morrison looked at Hayes. "Ready to do this again?" The old man stood, gathering his materials. "Captain, I've been ready for 40 years. Let's make sure your Marines come home safely." The temperature had dropped 30 degrees by 2200 hours. Morrison stood outside the command tent, watching his Marines conduct final equipment checks under red-filtered flashlights. The darkness of the Iraqi desert was absolute, the kind of black that city dwellers never experienced. Above them, stars filled the sky in numbers that seemed impossible. Hayes emerged from the tent, now wearing different clothes. Gone were the civilian khakis and faded shirts. Instead, he'd donned dark cargo pants and a black long-sleeve shirt. A tactical vest hung over his frame, though Morrison noticed it carried no ammunition, just water, a medical kit, and what looked like more of those hand-drawn maps. "You're coming with us?" Morrison asked, surprised. "Not all the way," Hayes replied, adjusting the straps on his vest. "But I'll guide you through the initial approach. Make sure you're oriented correctly. Once you reach the final staging point, I'll pull back." Lieutenant Hendricks joined them, his face painted with camouflage cream. "Sir, Alpha Team reports ready. Bravo and Charlie are completing their final comms check now." Morrison checked his watch. "They'd be rolling out in 40 minutes. Any issues with the night vision equipment?" "Negative. All systems are green." Hendricks glanced at Hayes. "We've got a spare headset if Mr. Hayes needs one for the approach." Hayes shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, Lieutenant, but I know that route well enough to walk it blind. Besides, I've found technology can be a crutch. Your eyes adjust to the dark if you let them." It was exactly the kind of statement that would have drawn chuckles 12 hours ago. Now, nobody doubted him. Corporal Chen approached, carrying a ruggedized tablet displaying the synchronized map data. "Captain, I've overlaid Mr. Hayes' route onto our GPS system. The terrain elevation matches his drawings within 2 meters. It's actually kind of incredible. The accuracy, I mean, for something done by hand." Hayes allowed himself a small smile. "Topography doesn't lie, Corporal. You just have to learn how to read it properly." Staff Sergeant Reeves appeared from the direction of the vehicle staging area. "Second platoon is mounted up and ready for civilian cordon duties. I've briefed them on the Abu Rashid compound and the mosque location. We'll establish our perimeter here and here." She pointed to locations on Chen's tablet, which should keep non-combatants clear of the engagement zone. Morrison reviewed her positions, noting how they formed a loose but effective barrier. "What's your plan if civilians try to approach during the operation?" "We've got interpreters ready with pre-scripted messages in Arabic," Reeves explained. "Basically explaining there's a safety concern and asking them to remain in their homes until the all clear. If anyone refuses to comply, we'll use non-lethal deterrents, flashbangs, warning shots into the ground. Last resort is physical detention, but I'd rather avoid that." "Agreed," Morrison said. The goal was to neutralize the threat without creating more enemies in the process. General Bradford emerged from the command tent with his aide, Captain Foster, a logistics officer who'd been coordinating support elements. "Captain Morrison, walk with me." They moved away from the group, boots crunching on the gravel. Bradford stopped at the perimeter, where the base's floodlights gave way to desert darkness. "I want to be clear about something," Bradford said quietly. "This operation carries risk beyond the tactical. If Hayes is wrong, if those caves don't exist, or if they're empty, we've committed significant resources based on the word of one man. That'll raise questions at division, maybe higher." Morrison understood the subtext. Bradford was putting his reputation on the line. "You trust him that much, sir?" "I trust his track record," Bradford replied. "Samuel Hayes has never given me bad intelligence. Not in Colombia, not in Afghanistan. Not anywhere. But more than that, I trust his motives. He's not doing this for glory or recognition. He's doing it because it's right. I noticed you two have history." Bradford nodded, his eyes distant. 26 years ago, I was a captain leading a platoon in the jungle. We were hunting a cartel logistics chief, working off intelligence that Samuel had developed. Everyone else wanted to hit what the satellites showed us. A compound with visible security, obvious fortifications. Samuel said that was the decoy, that the real operation center was 3 kilometers away in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. And he was right? "He was right," Bradford confirmed. "We found the logistics chief, his entire staff, and documentation that led to 14 more arrests. If we'd hit the obvious target, we'd have gotten nothing but low-level security guards, and the chief would have disappeared." That's when I learned something crucial about intelligence work. "What's that?" "The best intelligence doesn't come from the newest technology or the biggest budget. It comes from someone who takes the time to understand the ground truth, who sees what's actually there instead of what they expect to see." Bradford turned to face Morrison directly. "Hayes sees what's there. Always has." They walked back toward the staging area, where Marines were forming up into their designated teams. Morrison could feel the tension in the air, not fear, but focused anticipation. These were professionals preparing for dangerous work, and they knew it. Hayes was consulting with Sergeant Castellano, showing him something on one of the photographs. The sergeant was nodding, asking questions, his entire demeanor focused and serious. "One more thing," Bradford added. "When this is over, regardless of outcome, you don't mention Samuel's name in your official report. He's listed as local source with a cryptonym. His ability to operate in this region depends on maintaining his cover as a harmless eccentric." "Understood, sir." The platoon leaders gathered for final synchronization. Morrison spread a laminated map across the hood of a Humvee, red light casting everything in crimson tones. "Last chance for questions or concerns," Morrison said. Lieutenant Hendricks pointed to a spot on Hayes's recommended route. "This section here, where the wadi narrows, if we make contact before reaching the objective, will be channelized. Limited maneuver space." Hayes leaned in. Valid concern, Lieutenant. That's actually why I chose this route. Anyone setting up an ambush would expect you to avoid confined terrain. They'll be watching the open approaches, not the difficult ones. Sometimes the hard path is the safe path, and if you're wrong, Hendricks pressed, not disrespectfully, but needing to hear the answer. Then you'll have approximately 30 seconds to identify the threat before they do, Hayes said bluntly. Your point man needs to be sharp, watching for tripwires, pressure plates, anything that seems out of place. I'll be with you through that section. If I see something wrong, I'll signal immediately, Sergeant Castellano spoke up. What kind of signal? Hayes demonstrated a simple gesture, closed fist raised, then 2 fingers pointed down. This means freeze in place, possible threat. If I do this, he made a sweeping motion, it means move back the way you came, quickly but quietly. The Marines committed the signals to memory. Morrison appreciated Hayes's practicality. No complicated hand signals or jargon, just clear communication that anyone could understand in the dark. Time check, Morrison called out. 47 hours. Multiple voices responded in unison. We roll in 13 minutes. Mount up. The Marines moved to their vehicles with practiced efficiency. The convoy would consist of 4 Humvees for the initial approach, but they'd leave the vehicles at the staging point Hayes had identified and proceed on foot. In the dark, the rumble of diesel engines seemed impossibly loud, though Morrison knew the sound wouldn't carry far. Hayes climbed into Morrison's vehicle, settling into the rear passenger seat. The old man moved with surprising agility for his age. Though Morrison noticed he took an extra second to arrange his gear, protecting his lower back, Corporal Chen took the driver's seat, while Hendricks occupied the front passenger position. Morrison keyed his radio. All units, comms check. One by one, the vehicle commanders reported in. All systems operational. Sentinel-6, this is Atlas Actual, Morrison transmitted. Convoy departing in 5 mics. Copy Atlas Actual, came Bradford's voice. Godspeed. Bring them home safe. The base's main gate rolled open, revealing the desert beyond. Morrison felt the familiar pre-mission clarity settle over him. The heightened awareness, the mental checklist running through contingencies and responses. You doing okay back there, Mr. Hayes? Chen asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. Hayes was looking out at the darkness, his expression unreadable. I've done this more times than I can count, Corporal. But it never gets easy. Every mission, you're gambling with lives. The trick is making sure the odds are in your favor. Is that what you did? Hendricks asked.
Stack the odds?
I gave you accurate information, Hayes replied. What you do with it determines the outcome. But yes, if I've done my job right, the odds should be heavily in your favor. The convoy pulled out, 4 vehicles moving in tactical spacing through the night. Behind them, forward operating base Sentinel's lights grew smaller, then disappeared entirely. Ahead lay 15 kilometers of hostile territory, an uncertain objective, and a mission based on the knowledge of one man who'd been mocked just hours earlier. Morrison checked his rifle one final time, then looked at Hayes. The old man was staring into the darkness, and Morrison realized he was probably doing calculations in his head. Distances, timing, terrain features, the same analytical process that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work. Question for you, Morrison said quietly. Why do you still do this? You could have retired years ago, lived comfortably. Why keep putting yourself at risk? Hayes was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Because someone has to, Captain. And because I'm good at it. When you're good at something that saves lives, you don't just walk away. The convoy maintained complete light discipline as it rolled through the desert. Jen navigated using night vision goggles, the landscape rendered in shades of green through the enhanced optics. Beside him, Hendricks monitored the GPS while cross-referencing with Hayes's hand-drawn map, which he'd attached to a clipboard with a small red light for reading. They'd been driving for 37 minutes when Hayes leaned forward.
Slow down.
The turnoff is coming up on the left, about 200 meters. Chen eased off the accelerator. Morrison scanned the terrain through his own night vision, seeing nothing but endless rock and sand. Yet when they reached the point Hayes had indicated, a subtle depression in the landscape revealed itself, the beginning of the Wadi system. "This is it," Hayes confirmed. "Bear left, follow the natural contour." The Humvees turned in sequence, their tires finding purchase on the gravel bed. The Wadi's banks rose on either side, exactly as Hayes had described, providing concealment from anyone watching the surrounding ridgelines. They traveled another kilometer before Hayes called for a stop. "Staging point. This is where you dismount." Morrison keyed his radio. "All units, halt. Prepare to establish a security perimeter." The Marines exited their vehicles with practiced silence, weapons ready, immediately forming a defensive circle. The desert night pressed in around them, bringing with it the peculiar quiet that only exists far from civilization. No traffic sounds, no electrical hum, no human voices, just the whisper of wind across stone and the occasional distant bark of wild dogs. Staff Sergeant Reeves moved her team into position, establishing observation posts on the Wadi's banks. Through his night vision, Morrison watched them work with the efficiency that came from countless training repetitions and real-world experience. Hayes pulled out his map one final time, kneeling on the gravel and spreading it flat. Morrison, Hendricks, Castellano, and team leaders from each squad gathered around, their forms hunched in the darkness. "From here to the target is approximately 3 kilometers, Hayes began, his finger tracing the route. "The Wadi continues for another 1.5 kilometers, then you'll reach a junction where it splits. Take the right fork. The left leads to an area that floods during the rainy season. The ground is unstable." Sergeant Castellano marked the details on his own map. "What's our terrain like after the Wadi ends?" "Open ground for about 200 meters, but you'll have scattered boulders for concealment," Hayes explained. "The trick is timing. You want to cross that open section during the guard change I mentioned. They'll be focused on internal procedures, not external observation. That puts us crossing at approximately 03555 hours, Hendricks calculated. Hayes nodded. "Which means you need to reach the end of the Wadi no later than 0345, gives you a 10-minute buffer." Morrison checked his watch. 017 hours. They had over 2 hours to cover 3 kilometers. Deliberately slow to maintain noise discipline and avoid stumbling into unexpected obstacles. "Once you're past the open ground, you'll see a rock formation that looks like a split tooth," Hayes continued. "That's your visual landmark. The main cave entrance is 30 meters beyond it, bearing northeast. What about the secondary exits?" Morrison asked. Hayes indicated 2 other positions on his map. "Here and here. Both are smaller, really designed as escape routes rather than main entrances. If they run, that's where they'll go. You'll want observers on both positions before you make an entry." Corporal Chen had been studying the topographic lines on the map. "Mr. Hayes, this elevation change here, is it gradual or is there a drop-off?" "Sharp eye, Corporal," Hayes said approvingly. "There's a 3-meter ledge right there. Easy to miss in the dark, and a broken ankle is the last thing you need. When you reach that point, you'll need to climb down rather than jump. Use the natural handholds on the left side of the ledge." The level of detail continued to impress Morrison. Hayes hadn't just mapped the area. He'd walked every meter of it, noting not just what was there, but what could cause problems. "The insurgents," Hendricks said. "You estimated 15 to 20 personnel. Where do they typically position themselves?" Hayes pulled out another photograph, this one showing the cave entrance from a distance. "They keep 2 guards at the main entrance, usually seated just inside the opening where they're protected from the elements, but can still watch the approaches. The rest are deeper in the cave system. Based on the smoke I've observed, they're cooking and living about 50 meters inside, where the cave opens into a larger chamber." "Weapons?" Castellano asked. "AK-47s are standard. I've observed at least 2 RPGs, and one individual who appears to be a designated marksman with a scoped rifle. Looked like a Dragunov, though I can't be certain from the distance I was at." Morrison absorbed this information, mentally adjusting his assault plan. A trained marksman changed the equation significantly. What about sentries along our approach route? Morrison asked. Any chance they've got people positioned between here and there? That's the beauty of this approach, Hayes said. They're watching the obvious routes, the ones your previous patrols used. They've become complacent about this direction because the terrain looks too difficult. Insurgents, like everyone else, tend to assume others think the same way they do. They wouldn't use this route, so they don't expect you to either. Hayes stood, his knees cracking slightly with the movement. I'll lead you through the first kilometer, get you properly oriented. After that, you'll be on your own. I'll wait here with the vehicles. Negative, Morrison said firmly. You'll wait here, but you're pulling back to the fob with one of the Humvees once we're clear. Hayes opened his mouth to argue, but Morrison cut him off. General's orders. Once you've completed your part of the mission, you extract. We can't risk you being out here alone if things go sideways. After a moment, Hayes nodded. Fair enough. The Marines conducted final equipment checks, tightening straps, securing anything that might rattle, applying fresh camouflage paint to any exposed skin that might reflect moonlight. Chen distributed cough drops to each team member, a trick Morrison had learned early in his career. Dry throat and involuntary coughing had compromised more stealth approaches than most people realized. Morrison gathered his team leaders. Remember, noise discipline is paramount until we're compromised or until we initiate contact. Hand signals only. If someone goes down, the man behind him takes his place in the formation. We don't stop moving unless absolutely necessary. Rules of engagement? Ask Sergeant Travis Palmer, leader of Bravo Team. Standard ROE applies. Positive identification before engaging. But understand that once we hit that cave entrance, it's a confined space. Your reaction time drops to 0. If you see a weapon coming up in your direction, you engage immediately. The team leaders nodded. They'd all done close-quarters combat training, understood the brutal mathematics of room clearing and cave fighting. Hayes checked his own gear one final time, then looked at Morrison. Ready when you are, Captain. Atlas Element, prepare to move, Morrison transmitted on the radio. We're going tactical. The Marines switched their radios to low-power mode and activated their noise-canceling headsets. From here on, communications would be minimal whispers or hand signals. Hayes took point, moving with surprising quiet for someone his age. Morrison followed directly behind him, with Hendricks third in line. The formation stretched back like a snake through the wadi, each Marine maintaining visual contact with the person ahead. The gravel crunched softly under their boots despite their best efforts, but the sound didn't carry far. The wadi's walls rose higher as they progressed, creating a canyon effect that was simultaneously protective and claustrophobic. After 20 minutes of careful movement, Hayes raised his fist, the signal to halt. Everyone froze in place. Morrison waited, watching as the old man knelt and examined something on the ground. After several seconds, Hayes waved them forward and pointed down. In the gravel lay a thin wire, barely visible even with night vision. A tripwire. Hayes carefully traced its path with his finger without touching it, showing how it ran from one bank to the other, connected to what looked like tin cans filled with rocks, a crude but effective early warning system. Morrison felt cold sweat on the back of his neck. Without Hayes, they would have walked right into it. The old man carefully marked the wire's location with small rocks, then indicated a path around it. One by one, the Marines stepped over the wire, each man pausing to mark it for the person behind him. The process was agonizingly slow, but nobody rushed. Once clear of the tripwire, Hayes turned to Morrison and made a gesture. 2 fingers to his eyes, then pointing ahead. More obstacles to watch for. They continued, the wadi twisting through the terrain, exactly as Hayes's map had indicated. Morrison found himself developing a profound respect, not just for the man's knowledge, but for his methodology. This wasn't guesswork or luck. This was the result of systematic observation, careful documentation, and the wisdom to know which details mattered. At the 40-minute mark, they reached the junction Hayes had mentioned. The left fork did indeed look unstable, Morrison could see where the ground had a different texture, darker and more compressed. They took the right fork, the formation compressing slightly as the wadi narrowed. Hayes moved slower now, scanning constantly. Morrison realized they were entering the zone, where the insurgents might have placed additional security measures. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every unusual rock formation might conceal an observer. The old man suddenly dropped to one knee, raising his fist. The entire column froze. Morrison watched as Hayes examined the ground, then the banks, then back to the ground. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, Hayes signaled all clear, and they continued. Morrison wanted to ask what he'd seen, but maintaining silence was more important. He filed it away for the after-action review. They were 1 kilometer in now, exactly on schedule. The night remained quiet except for the wind, and Morrison allowed himself to hope that Hayes's intelligence was as good as his reputation suggested. Then, from somewhere ahead, came a sound that made everyone freeze, the distinctive metallic click of a weapon being cocked. Every Marine in the column had their weapon raised. Safeties off, fingers indexed along the trigger guards. Morrison's heart hammered against his ribs as he strained to identify the source of the sound. 30 seconds passed in absolute stillness. Then it came again, not ahead of them but above. Morrison's eyes tracked upward to the wadi's bank, and through his night vision he spotted the source. A wild dog, its jaw working as it gnawed on something, the movement creating that distinctive metallic clicking against what must have been a discarded can. Hayes had already identified it. He pointed up, then made a calming gesture with his hand. False alarm! The Marines slowly lowered their weapons, adrenaline still coursing through their systems. Morrison caught Hendrix's eye and saw his own relief reflected there. They resumed movement, even more careful now that they understood how on edge everyone was. The wadi began to shallow out as they approached the end of Hayes's guided route. The old man checked his watch, then held up his hand, 5 fingers, then 3. They'd reached the transition point 53 minutes into the infiltration. Hayes led them to a cluster of large boulders that provided excellent concealment. Once the entire element was gathered, he pulled Morrison aside, speaking directly into his ear in the barest whisper. "This is where I leave you. The open ground is 300 meters ahead. You've got," he checked his watch again, 2 hours and 17 minutes until the guard change window. Use the time to observe, identify patterns, make final adjustments to your plan. Morrison nodded, then surprised himself by extending his hand. Hayes gripped it firmly, and in that moment, Morrison understood why General Bradford trusted this man so completely. "Thank you," Morrison whispered. "For everything." Hayes simply nodded, then turned and began making his way back down the wadi, disappearing into the darkness with the same quiet competence he'd displayed throughout the night. Morrison gathered his team leaders, and they began the delicate process of conducting reconnaissance on their objective. Sergeant Castellano and Corporal Chen moved forward to establish an observation post, low-crawling the final 50 meters to a position where they could see the target area. What they found confirmed every detail Hayes had provided. The rock formation, shaped like a split tooth, stood exactly where the map indicated. Beyond it, barely visible in the starlight, was a darker shadow that marked the cave entrance. Through their optics, they identified 2 sentries positioned just inside the opening, exactly as Hayes had described. One was smoking, the occasional glow of his cigarette creating a pinpoint of light in the darkness. Chen sketched the layout in his notebook, while Castellano used a laser rangefinder to mark exact distances. They spent 40 minutes cataloging every detail, the sentries' weapons, their body language, the positions they favored, how often they moved or communicated. The 2 secondary exits Hayes had identified were harder to spot, but careful observation revealed disturbed earth and scuff marks that suggested regular use. Morrison positioned Palmer's Bravo team to cover the western exit and assigned a fire team from Charlie to watch the eastern one. Time crawled forward. At 03:42 hours, Morrison noticed increased activity at the main entrance. The two sentries stood, stretching, and moments later 2 different individuals emerged from the cave's darkness to replace them. The outgoing guards exchanged a few words, then headed deeper into the cave. The guard change. Exactly as Hayes had predicted, Morrison waited another 3 minutes, allowing the new sentries to settle into their positions and lose their initial alertness. Then he gave the signal to move. Alpha Team crossed the open ground in a staggered rush, using the scattered boulders for concealment. It took 8 minutes to traverse terrain that would have taken 2 in daylight, but they made it without detection. The sentries remained focused inward, occasionally talking to each other, but never scanning their surroundings with any real attention. Complacency, Morrison thought. The deadliest enemy of security. They stacked up at the entrance, and Morrison could now see inside the cave. The tunnel extended back into darkness, with the flickering glow of firelight visible deeper in, confirming Hayes's observation about the living area 50 meters inside. Morrison tapped Hendricks on the shoulder. The lieutenant raised his hand, showing 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. They moved. The 2 sentries never had a chance to raise their weapons. Morrison and Hendricks covered them instantly, while 2 other Marines moved in to secure and zip-tie them. The entire action took less than 6 seconds and produced almost no noise. 2 secured, Hendricks whispered into his radio. Bravo in position. Western exit covered, Palmer reported. Charlie observing eastern exit. Negative movement. Came the 3rd confirmation. Morrison's team pushed deeper into the cave. Night vision revealing a tunnel that widened gradually. The rock walls showed evidence of tool marks. This was indeed a modified natural formation, expanded by human effort, just as Hayes had described. The glow of the firelight grew stronger as they advanced. Morrison could hear voices now, speaking in Arabic, relaxed and casual. The sound of someone laughing. The clatter of cookware. They reached the edge of the larger chamber. Morrison held up his fist, and the team froze. He counted 17 individuals in the space, more than Hayes's estimate, but within the predicted range. Most were sleeping or resting. 3 sat around a small fire, preparing what looked like morning tea. Weapons were stacked against the walls, close at hand but not immediately ready. Along the far wall, Morrison saw what they'd come for. Wooden crates, stenciled with Cyrillic letters. Russian-made weapons, confirmed. At least 20 crates visible, and probably more in the darker recesses of the cave. Morrison keyed his radio. Atlas actual to Sentinel-6, target confirmed. Multiple jackpots. Initiating capture operations. Copy Atlas actual. We're standing by. What happened next was textbook. The Marines swept into the chamber with overwhelming speed and precision. Commands in Arabic boomed through the space, demanding immediate surrender. Flashlights blazed, destroying night vision and disorienting anyone who'd been sleeping. 3 insurgents reached for weapons. They were neutralized instantly, with controlled shots that echoed thunderously in the confined space. The rest faced with professional soldiers who'd achieved complete tactical surprise. Surrendered. The entire action lasted 47 seconds from first movement to last detainee secured. Morrison moved to the crates and pried one open. Inside were surface-to-air missiles, exactly as Hayes had warned. Another crate held anti-tank weapons. A third contained enough plastic explosive to level a city block. "Sir, you need to see this," Castellano called from a side tunnel. Morrison followed him into a smaller chamber that served as a communications center. Maps covered one wall, showing coalition patrol routes, base locations, and attack plans. A laptop sat on a makeshift table, still powered on. "This is bigger than a weapons cache," Morrison said, photographing everything. "This is a planning cell." By 0530 hours, the cave was secured, detainees were processed, and explosive ordnance disposal teams were cataloguing the weapons. General Bradford arrived by helicopter as the sun broke over the horizon. Transforming the desert from black to gold, Morrison met him at the landing zone. Dust still swirling from the rotor wash. "Report," Bradford said simply. 17 detainees. No friendly casualties, substantial weapons cache seized, And intelligence materials that'll keep Division busy for weeks, Morrison replied. Sir Hayes's intelligence was perfect. Every detail, every prediction, it all checked out exactly as he said. Bradford allowed himself a slight smile. Where is he now? Back at the fob. I sent him home with the first vehicle return. They walked toward the cave entrance, where Marines were carrying out crate after crate. Bradford stopped at the opening, looking at the hand-drawn map Morrison had pulled from his vest. You know what the most impressive thing about Samuel is? Bradford asked. It's not that he knows how to gather intelligence. It's that he understands why it matters. Every detail he gave you, every observation he made. It was all in service of bringing your Marines home alive. Morrison looked at the map, at the careful notations and precise drawings. We owe him our lives, sir. Without his guidance, we'd have walked right past this place, or worse, stumbled into it from the wrong direction. Make sure that goes in your after-action review, Bradford said. Not his name, but the lesson. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from the most unexpected sources. And when you find someone who really knows the ground truth, you listen. 3 weeks later, Morrison sat in General Bradford's office back in Baghdad. The intelligence from the cave had led to 12 more arrests and the disruption of 3 planned attacks. The weapons had been destroyed, the detainees were being interrogated, and the entire northern corridor was significantly safer. The general wanted me to give you this, Bradford's aide said, handing Morrison a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on plain paper. Captain Morrison, glad it worked out. The old ways still have merit, even in this high-tech age. Your Marines did excellent work. Take care of them. SH tucked behind the note was another hand-drawn map, this one showing a different sector entirely, with a new set of annotations and observations. Morrison smiled. Hayes was already working on the next mission. Some lessons, he realized, couldn't be taught in training schools or found in field manuals. They came from people who'd spent decades perfecting their craft, who understood that technology was a tool, but human judgment was irreplaceable. The Marines had scoffed at an old man's map. Now they knew better, and that knowledge, Morrison suspected, would serve them well for the rest of their careers. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.